Noswaith i chi gyd. Good evening to all. It's a great pleasure to be with you virtually this evening for the second time. So I hope you enjoy what I'm going to talk about on roads. I've been interested in roads since the County Council decided to paint all the surviving milestones in the county. They used to look like this, and then they looked a lot better and much clearer. And I suddenly became aware of how many there were. So I thought I'd like to know just how many there were, where they are, how old they are, and who put them up. Well, the answer to the first question is relatively easy. There are about 40 surviving in the county, but I think there must have been about 80 altogether originally. So half of them are gone. And possibly one of the reasons they've gone is that during the Second World War, Ceredigion was a front line, potentially, to the Nazis who might have invaded Britain along the west coast of Wales from Ireland. Of course, they never did. But tank traps were put up along the coastline in Ceredigion. And there was an instruction throughout Britain to hide milestones and signposts. So they should have been taken down and buried, but I can't believe they put them all back again. So I suspect they would never moved at all. And those that have disappeared were in the way of whatever was being developed. So there are lots in various different places, all on the roadside and mostly quite clear now. So this one, which you can hardly read at all, has been considerably improved by painting. This was done about 25 years ago, and I don't think they've been painted much since then. So they had to work out what that figure should be because it's completely disappeared from the right-hand, the original view. And then this nastily broken one hit by a lorry on the roadside between Aberystwyth and Machynlleth has been repaired. Or was repaired, and then it was knocked over again, and it's in pieces, sadly. But the County Council obviously were, when they had the funds, looking after them as part of our history. So their age, I know the age of them, and they're not as old as I hope they would be. They're not the original ones, sadly. And they are distributed on all the main roads and a few of the side roads. But I'll talk about those later. They all have whole miles marked on them. If you go to other parts of Wales, you can often see subdivisions of miles like this: 10 miles, 970 yards to Tenby. But of course, that's to a particular point in Tenby. But I did want to talk about the older roads as well. So we'll start off with the Roman roads. I'm sure there were prehistoric trackways in the county. Quite possibly people were bringing gold over from Ireland and landing on the coast in Ceredigion and then walking inland from there with their hoard of treasure. And there were no doubt there were trackways going up and down the coast as well in the county. But really, it's very difficult to be sure about those. But once the Romans arrived, of course, they built substantial roads, and we have a major Roman road going right through the county from Llanio, not far from Lampeter, up to Trawscoed, where there's a Roman fort, to Cabal Bangor fort, yet another little fort, just south of Machynlleth, and then there was a bridge, presumably over the river, to another major fort at Pennell. And then the road continues. And we're gradually finding out more and more about the location of these roads. They are appearing in aerial photographs during dry weather, for example. But of course, those roads did survive in places. Here we have a superb example of a Roman road in the county. Pennell Fort is down just off the photograph, and you can see a dead straight track, which is the Roman road still being used, but with a kink in it, where I assume there was a damp patch and people just kept skirting around it and making that kink larger and larger. So that bit of Roman road is very clear, and then it disappears completely. It was not reused subsequently, and it's only recently we've been able to find out where probably the majority of the Roman road is in the county. There's only patches like this so clear on the ground. Then we do know a little bit about medieval bridges, not the roads, because there's not a lot recorded about those, but if there were bridges, there must have been roads leading to them. So in 1116, we know there was a bridge over the Ystwyth, very close to the early earth and timber fort that was here. And in 1116, the Welsh attacked that fort and had to cross the wooden bridge over the Ystwyth. And sadly, the Welsh were defeated, and the Brita Tywysogi on the Chronicle of the Princes said the whole land was laid to waste by the Normans. Then we know of a bridge at Ceredigion because Archbishop Baldwin, accompanied by Giraldus Cambrensis, stopped there on their way around Wales when they were gathering volunteers for the Third Crusade, and they make a reference to a bridge over the Teifi there. Then we know about Devil's Bridge, or properly Pontarvanach, which may be 12th century, and it may be this bridge, but that may well be a rebuild of the medieval bridge if it was built in medieval times, not necessarily by the monks. And then the very name Llanbedr Pont Steffan suggests that there was a bridge there in medieval times. The name for Lampeter, of course. And we also know that the road between Carmarthen and Aberystwyth was widened for safer travel because all the materials, or a lot of the materials for Aberystwyth Castle and the money to pay the men was brought by road from Carmarthen rather than take it around the coast. And if they were bringing large quantities of money to pay the soldiers over 12 years, which is what it took to build the castle, they did want to be able to carry that safely. And the wider the road, the fewer places there are for potential thieves to attack the money carriers. So there is a reference to the roads being widened at that time for security purposes. And then, of course, in Ceredigion, and particularly Strata Florida, we've got roads leading to significant sites. Strata Florida itself, St David's, and we've got Ysbyty Ystwyth and Ysbyty Cynfyn, which were probably resting places for the pilgrims. And I'm sure people could work out the main routes for those, but it's not something I've looked at in any real detail. And we've also got important roads for the drovers who were taking their cattle to market in England, and they tried to avoid the toll roads where they would have had to pay substantial sums to take their cattle. So we have roads like this in very remote places because they were not toll roads, so they could travel freely on those. And we got a description of one in 1795 saying, "We took a guide from Tregaron to Llandovery over the long and trackless mountains of Cardiganshire. It rained hard the whole way, and we had not even the gloomy consolation of seeing a partner of our misfortunes. For we neither beheld a single habitation nor even a human creature for more than 20 miles, which just shows you how isolated those roads could be. But I think many of the roads in the county might have looked like this. This is the path I walk up almost every day to the National Library from Llanbadarn. It may not have been much more than this because you could either walk or go on horseback, but very, very few roads were fit to take wheeled vehicles. So we've got sledges or cartlisk being used frequently in Wales until the early 19th century. And these were used to drag the produce of the fields and also, I think, some industrial materials as well on rough ground. They didn't use the roads, they used trackways and fields. It's quite amusing to see they're actually racing with one of these in the distance in this painting by Ibbotson in 1795. And in Montgomeryshire, we know that wheeled vehicles were rare because this visitor says that he was told by the innkeeper that the only carriages in use were wagons, and those had just been introduced, and they found that making cartwheels was something really special, a great curiosity, as he said. And before that date, most people travel on foot or on horseback. So wheeled vehicles were extremely rare, mainly because the roads were so bad. And even to carry all the incredibly heavy lead ore that came from so many mines in the county, it was transported in panniers on horseback, 15, 20 miles down to the coast at Aberystwyth and some of the other ports. So they didn't need a road, they just needed a track. And peat also was transported from isolated places to the homes of the people who needed it for fuel, and it could be carried in panniers once it was dry. It was much better to carry it when it was dry, or in these sledges of various sorts that are illustrated here, or even on hand sledge carts like this, a bit like a bier for a funeral. And that one is now on display in Tregaron. And the other problem, of course, were hills, because getting a wheeled carriage up a hill was a problem. And there's this wonderful medieval illustration showing them pushing it up a steep hill, but bringing it down was also a problem. So it was extremely dangerous to lose control of a wheeled vehicle like this. So this is a painting of a Royal Mail carriage, and it's got skids on the wheels, and you can see that in a bit more detail here. These are pieces of iron slipped under the wheels to stop them revolving, so they slid down steep hills, and they're attached in place with a chain. If those chains broke, then the carriage probably wouldn't go much further, especially on hills, and they would have to go and get the chain and the skid repaired by a blacksmith. Blacksmiths then were a bit like the AA now. You just got hold of one nearby and they came and sorted out your problem. So that photograph was, that painting was of a vehicle that had just come onto the flat, and they would have taken their skid away, and it would probably have been extremely hot. And the roads were also dangerous for other reasons, and accidents did occur. Quite a lot seem to have occurred. I've just read about somebody who said that carriages between Holyhead and Chester had accidents several times a month. And I've just also read this reference by Erasmus Phillips of Picton Castle in Pembrokeshire, who said the roads of this county, Brecconshire, are very poor, and the county may be termed breakneckshire. And obviously people were killed and seriously injured as a result of accidents of this sort. And snow was another problem, and we have this wonderful description from the Times newspaper of an accident in a coach from Aberystwyth, in the mail coach, on its way to Kington from Aberystwyth, overturned on Monday at a place which I think must be Eisteddfod, going at the foot of Plinlimmon. In consequence of the snowstorm, the coachman had provided an extra pair of horses, and the postilion, and there were such things, missed his way in the crossing the road, where on one side is a ravine of considerable depth, into which the coach and the two inside passengers, Mr. J. Hughes, who was a solicitor, and Mr. Monkhouse, a brewer, were precipitated, the whole turning over twice or thrice, and yet both gentlemen miraculously escaped with only a few slight scratches and bruises. The coachman and the guard threw themselves off and were not hurt, and the postilion received no injury, although he was in a most perilous situation. And in a few hours, the coach was righted. And that seems unbelievable, since it had gone down a ravine and toppled over a couple of times, but that's the Times, and it must have told the truth then. So there were accidents of this sort, and they were determined to get through whatever the weather. And the other problem was that it was safer to walk downhill rather than go in the carriage, because the carriage might lose control. And for the sake of the horses, people were often asked to walk uphill. So you might have paid a lot of money for a journey and spend half the time in Wales walking up and down the hills, which seems very unfair, but at least it would transport your baggage for you. And in some cases, the roads were extremely narrow. This is the narrowest bit of road I can think of that still exists in Ceredigion. It's the bridge at Clarach on the way to Borth. And what would happen on a narrow road like this if you were faced with a carriage coming the opposite direction? You reversing with the carriage and being unable to turn it around would have been a really difficult problem. So they may have had to find some way or other of getting to adjacent fields. So there's wonderful Catherine Hutton, who wrote about travelling around Wales at the end of the 18th century, said not even a cat could have passed us in some places, it was so narrow. And there were precipices with no safety rails or anything, and this wonderful painting by one of the two painters who toured around Wales in 1792. This is Ibbotts, and then the other was John Warwick Smith. The horses were frightened by the lightning, which is shown in this painting, and one of the passengers is rapidly trying to get a stone under the wheel of the carriage to stop it rolling back down the hill. And people like Catherine Hutton said she was so scared of going along in a carriage where there were precipices dropping dozens, if not hundreds of feet down on the side of the road. And there's another lovely description by a woman of them travelling from Tenby to Aberystwyth. We have been the last 3 days at the Hafod Arms with delightful weather for exploring those beautiful scenes. Indeed, they are magnificent, and so they had need to be to repay us for all the torture of getting to them. Never let those who value their bones or their carriages try and make their way from Tenby to Aberystwyth. Oh, such roads! We were 6 hours getting over 25 miles with 4 stout horses, and the main spring gave away, so the blacksmith had to be called out again. We came o'er moorland and mountain, the wind in hurricanes and the rain in torrents. But these were brave people who were determined to experience the landscape of Wales at the time. And then they end up writing such lovely descriptions of their journeys. Another problem was potentially highway robbery, but it seems to have been very unlikely, especially in this part of the country. And the last time a highway robber was hanged in Britain was in 1813. And it was rare because the punishment was very serious. It was death. The roads are much better and faster, so there were more people on them, so the robbers might have more chance of being caught. The roads were being made wider to allow 2 vehicles to pass each other. So it was more difficult to hide and easier to escape. The common land was gradually being taken over, and there were fewer woods, so they had fewer places to hide in. There were safer means of transporting cash. What you did actually was cut the banknotes in half and transported them separately. So they were of no use to anybody until you joined the two halves together. And it's possible that people had more reliable guns. And there is an account of a lord who said if he came up against a particular highwayman, he would shoot him dead. And he did. And of course, he wasn't taken to court for it because he was entitled to do that. But there is a story about a robbery on the road from Llandybrig to Lampeter. And this is recorded by a tourist who was told of it by one of the postboys. And apparently it was a tremendous robbery which had lately been committed on one of the hills on which we had to pass. It appeared from his account that a gang of men infested the neighbouring mountains who had some days ago attacked an individual returning from Cardigan Bank and robbed him of £600. The handwriting is really poor, so I'm not absolutely sure whether it was 600 or 100, but it's still a vast amount of money at that time, and nearly beaten him to death. But there were 5 of them altogether in this coach travelling from Llandybrig to Lampeter. And they wished they had pistols, but I think they had swords, so walking sticks with a sword inside, and they didn't get robbed. But it is possible that story was made up because I can't find anything about it in the newspapers of the time, and the Cambrian was being published in Swansea at that time. So I would have thought if somebody had been robbed even of 100, it would have been reported. I think it's possible that story was made up to make the passengers feel more comfortable when they arrived safely and give the carriage people a bigger tip. Bridges were also tremendously important, and when they got washed away, you would often have miles and miles to go out of the way to continue on your journey. So the medieval bridge at Aberystwyth, shown in this drawing of about 1790, was washed away in 1796. John Nash, the famous architect, designed this wooden bridge to replace it temporarily. And then he designed the stone bridge, which in turn was washed away in a massive storm in 1886, exactly 90 years later. And once those bridges went, it must have taken a long time to get them rebuilt, so a great inconvenience to everybody. There was a great flood in 1846. Early on an August morning, all the villagers of Telsarn went into the fields to do the harvest. And I think it's quite likely that everybody did, all the men and, all the women and children, as well as the men. When they got back home that night, they had no homes. The entire village had been washed away by a flash flood. Nothing survived. All their possessions were floating around in Aberaeron harbour, along with some coffins that had been washed into the harbour from local cemeteries. And the two bridges on the main road from Aberaeron to Aberystwyth in Llanon itself were washed away completely. But within hours, the magistrates who were responsible for maintaining bridges had arranged for men to go to these two bridges with lanterns to help people down into the bottom of the valley, because by that time the water had washed away and there was no more than a stream trickling in the bottom. And they were there to help people cross over the stream bed until they could replace the bridge with this good stone structure. And nearly all the other bridges between Llanon and Telsarn were washed away at that time and had to be replaced. So these were events that occurred quite often. And as I said, people's possessions were found in Aberaeron harbour, but I do hope that this was not what was found there. And I can't believe that cots like that would actually be waterproof enough to have floated for long, but it is a rather nice picture, I think, nonetheless. And then you also had to get across estuaries and broad rivers where there were no bridges, and these were obviously done with ferries. There were no major ferries in Ceredigion, the nearest probably being Britain Ferry, but several in North Wales. And you not only had to get your carriage in, but you had to get the horses in too. And this is rather poor picture, I think, of Dyfi Ferry from Ynys over to Aberdyfi in the distance here. And you can see these people waiting to cross on the ferry. There's one ferry there with a horse in it, and there's another ferry there also with a horse. So you can see them in this enlargement. And it must have been quite troublesome getting horses into the boats and out again at the other side and keeping them pretty stable while they were in the boat. And of course, this is a particularly dangerous ferry crossing because of the tides. So if you were travelling around Wales during the 18th and 19th century, before the railways came, there were several ways of travelling. If you were extremely rich, you would have your own coach and possibly your own horses, although you could hire horses, but you would have to be very, very rich to own one of those. You could hire a post coach, often known as a post chaise, where you hire the carriage and a postilion or a driver, and the horses would be changed at every post place where horses were made available. These cost at least £1 a mile. So if you were going from, say, Aberystwyth to Machynlleth, that's 18 miles, so that's 18 shillings, and then you'd have to pay half that cost for it to return to Aberystwyth, whether you were in it or not. So you're paying a lot of money for a relatively short distance. But that's what they expected. It was the standard fee. A slightly cheaper way and more comfortable was to go in a commercial stagecoach, and these could take up to 18 passengers, but A, they could be crowded, and B, there was no guarantee there was a space for you when you were in a particular place and wanted to go somewhere else. So you might have to wait 2 or 3 more days until another coach turned up. or pay a lot of money for a post chaise or walk, which is what a lot of people did. And then you could go on a mail coach, which was the fastest, but they could only take 4 people inside and a maximum of 6 outside. And these were relatively cheap. You had to put up with the passengers who were in there with you, of course, and you would be outside, if that's what you could afford, all day and all night, whatever the weather. So here's an example of the London to Aberystwyth coach in 1816. It went via Oxford and Worcester. It left London at 3 in the afternoon on a Monday and arrived at Aberystwyth at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. That's 51 hours of almost no stops except for meals. And if the coach, if it was a mail coach, this isn't, but if it was a mail coach, it had to leave on time. So if you arrived late, you still had to leave at the time you were meant to. And there are a few stories of people going into the inn, having arrived at a particular place for a meal, being sat down with a hot meal in front of them, and then the horn blows and they have to go without having consumed their supper or whatever. So this was relatively cheap. It was only £1, 2 shillings for the whole distance from London to Aberystwyth. But it was a very arduous journey. And then in 1840, sometime later, we got this lovely comment. In 1803, there were only 1 or 2 public carriages at Aberystwyth. So we do know that Catherine Hutton's father, who brought her to Aberystwyth in 1787, had to go back to work in Birmingham, and he had to walk all the way to Shrewsbury because he couldn't get a wheeled vehicle in Aberystwyth. And he says there's no vehicles in Cardigan. Now, good roads and steam, the railways, just have almost annihilated time and space. And London can be reached from Aberystwyth in 24 hours, when formerly it required that time just to get to Shrewsbury. So the roads certainly improved by the 1830s. And then, of course, they were very quickly taken over by the railways. So roads were maintained by the parish. Each parish had to maintain the roads in their area, and they nominated people to do that work for a year, each year. So it was your responsibility to maintain the roads during a year, or you could pay somebody else to do it for you. But in parishes where there were busy roads, it was thought very unfair because they had to do a lot more work to maintain the busy roads rather than back roads that most parishes had. But the bridges were maintained by the quarter sessions, which is the magistrates, effectively a county organisation, and they could raise money to repair bridges, but they weren't responsible for the roads. And so towards the end of the 18th century, roads were improved on a major scale throughout Britain and Wales in particular. And they were improved for various reasons. Firstly, they wanted the militia to be able to travel around. You'll all know about the invasion of Fishguard in 1797 by the French, and they needed to get to soldiers to places like that very quickly. And certainly that's why Scotland has got such good roads. It was to control the so-called natives there in the middle of the 18th century. The central and local government needed to communicate in various practical ways, and that meant delivering things. The gentry wanted to manage their affairs, and really there were 2 ways in which they needed to travel. One was to get to each other's houses for social reasons and for dances and that sort of thing. And the other one was to get to their lawyers in order to sue each other. And then another very important thing was the distribution of lime to sweeten the soil. And that was brought to the coast by boat and then transported around the whole county by horse-drawn vehicles. And of course, Wales was the industrial capital of the world. At the end of the 18th century, it produced more natural materials than anywhere else. It was the most industrialized country in the world. And so much was being produced that had to be transported away in order to sell it. So the roads were required for that. And of course, some of the very early railways were also used for that. So this is a map of all the toll roads in Wales. And you can see it's a pretty even distribution. Initially, the roads were improved by individual trusts just for a particular road that went from one place to another. So the main road from London to Holyhead, for example, the Irish road, was one trust. But gradually each county had its own trust to improve all the roads in their county. And Ceredigion, Cardiganshire, was the very last but one in Wales to have its own trust. It was divided into two halves, one in the south of the county and one in the north, but they had the same Act of Parliament and got established at the same time. And then you have the main roads going from Chester along the north coast of Wales to Holyhead, and then of course later on the much better road was built around the base of Snowdon to Bangor and then up to Holyhead. And that, in some people said, that was described as being like a billiard table. It was so smooth. It was such a superb road. And then in the south of Wales, there are two main roads, one via Brecon and one via Cardiff, Swansea, Neath, onto Carmarthen and then down to Haverfordwest and Milford, which was of course an important port. And for some people, it was easier and cheaper to get along the south coast by boat from Bristol rather than to travel by road. It took them much longer by road, but of course if the weather was bad, then it was better than being tossed around in a relatively small boat along the south coast of Wales. So the first trust in Ceredigion, Cardiganshire, was in 1770, and that was passed to cover the whole county. And they set up toll gates where they could charge the users of the roads so much per vehicle or horse or animal. And then there's a long list of exemptions, as you can see from this sign, which is now on the reconstruction of the toll gate from Aberystwyth, now in St Fagans. So the charges didn't seem very much, but they added up. So if you were in a vehicle with 4 horses, you had to pay 1 shilling and 6pence. Sorry, that's with 6 horses. And then if you only had 4 horses, it was 1 shilling. So it comes out at 3pence per horse, which is quite a lot when you're travelling around Wales, going through one toll gate after another with 2 or 3 horses or more. And then if you've just got a horse-drawn carriage carrying not people but goods, then it's 3pence again. If you've just got a horse carrying something in panniers or on its back, or you as a traveller, you paid 1 penny, and then for every drove of animals it's 10pence per score. And I bet there were enormous arguments about counting sheep and cattle going through the gates for that. So that's the charges, and that was pretty straightforward. And then they had a long list of exemptions. So if you were repairing the road or manuring or transporting ploughs and harrows or going to an election or going to church or attending a funeral or taking your animals to pasture or water or carrying the mail or soldiers or vagrants, then you didn't have to pay. And one way of avoiding to pay for goods that you might be carrying in a wagon was to cover it all in manure. So if you wanted a pile of bricks or something else to take to your farm, you just hide it under a pile of manure because manure was free, and you just hoped that the person at the gate wouldn't poke it to find out what was underneath. But they didn't think of everything that was that should be exempted. And one of them was this case where the Aberystwyth town fire engine had to go through Northgate in Aberystwyth in 1888 and pay 2 shillings on their way to a fire. And I love the idea of these heavily bearded men fumbling around in their pockets for farthings and halfpennies and pennies to see if they can make up 2 shillings. I do hope that actually they were allowed through to the fire and then paid on their way back. Because one of the things about the gates is that you only paid once in a day. If you went through the same gate many times, you only had to pay once. So it didn't matter if you were definitely coming back, you could pay on the way back. And what they didn't also think about were strange animals like this. And we do know that there were menageries of animals travelling around Wales as early as 1828 and possibly earlier, but they were in wheeled vehicles, so they had to pay whatever was due for that. But what do you pay for an elephant? And you will know about the elephant that was buried at Tregaron, according to the story. If it was actually walking all that way, would it have to pay because it's not on the list of things to pay for and it's not on the exemptions? There are quite a lot of toll gates surviving. There were 3 in Aberaeron, which is where this one is, 2 in Aberystwyth, 3 in Cardigan, and then several on the main roads, such as places like Llanon and on the county borders. And quite a few of those survive. Most of them are now houses. And this is the one that was at Southgate in Aberystwyth that was very carefully dismantled and re-erected at St Fagans. And it's been possible to work out that repairing an old road to bring it up to standard or building a new road cost around £40 a mile, which is a reasonable amount to pay, I think, at that time. And we don't know how much work was being done on some roads because they were just improving them. There were new roads being built. So there were new roads being built around Havod. The old road used to run into the Havod estate, but Thomas Johns didn't want that. So it was diverted to nearer the bridge where he had built a hotel. And he obviously wanted people to go and stay there and appreciate the bridge. And this was the old main road from Aberystwyth east into England. This road. So the gentry did have some control over where the roads went on their land. And it is also interesting to note that the 2 of the first roads to be completed were those that went to Nanteos Mansion and Gogerthen Mansion from Aberystwyth. And both of those gentry families were represented on the trusts for the road building. So there was a bit of self-benefit going on there. The original act was meant to only last 21 years, and it was thought within that period, it would be possible to complete all the work that was needed to be done and retrieve all the expenses by charging people. And at the end of that 21-year period, they could stop charging. But of course, that didn't happen. And we know that they wanted to build some new roads. And they said that they'd spent nearly £2,000 and they'd raised an average of £277 in 7 years. Well, that comes to nearly £2,000. But I have a very strong suspicion that the trustees spent quite a lot of money on food and drink after their meetings, which they had quite regularly. And that's where some of the money went. So the new tolls were considerably increased. So instead of 3p per horse on each vehicle, it was 6p, which was a considerable increase. And if you were travelling on a Sunday, you had to pay 4 times that amount of money, 4 times 3p per animal. Seems very unfair unless you could prove you're going to church or chapel. And there were other increases, the most important of which is that before 1791, transport of lime was free. After that date, you had to pay half the usual toll. And what happened to avoid paying too much was that the lime carriers lined up their carts by a toll gate at midnight, and then they went through that gate as many times as they possibly could in the next 24 hours, and they only had to pay once. If they started one day and gone on to the next, they'd have to pay twice. So that was one way of avoiding what appears to be pennies, but of course, if you're going to be doing that regularly, you need to avoid paying significant sums over a long period of time. And then 42 years later, after the first act, there was a third act in 1812, and they wanted to build a new road to avoid going up Cymestwyth Valley and through Ffyrdd and eastwards into England. Now, Cymestwyth is beautiful and the valley is spectacular, but people didn't like it, and it was very, very isolated, as it still is. So instead of that road, they built a new road going through Capel Bangor and Tryda. This is it, the A44, and that is the old road to Capel, Devil's Bridge. So this was, much of this was a new road, completely new in places and improved in others. And it was 1 mile longer than the old road. But people said, well, it's so much faster. You won't mind traveling an extra mile. And if you're paying £1 a mile, that does make a difference. If you're walking, that makes a difference. But on horseback, it's not going to make all that much difference. And along that road, some new inns were built. So we have this one at Dufferin Castle, which I haven't been past recently, except in the dark, actually, the other day. So I didn't see whether they've been able to continue to improve it. But you can see the carriage sheds here with their arches, over 3 arches there for the carriages, and a substantial inn, very attractive building right on the roadside, built specifically as an inn for travellers on that road. And not all that far away was the George Borough, not originally called that. It was originally the Gorgeirn Arms. But this also was a roadside inn for those travelling along that new road. There was yet another act in Ceredigion, and this was specifically for a road from Newquay to Aberaeron to run right along the coast. It was never actually built. But they did anticipate 2 other things in this act. First of all, if you had very thick tyres, you paid less than if you had narrow tyres, because narrow tyres damaged the road surface much more easily than a broad wheel. And the shape of the tire of the wheel as well also affected how much you paid. In this case, they did reduce the charge for horses and other animals, laden or unladen, going through the gate. So this is one of those broad tired vehicles. It looks like it's inflated tires, but it's obviously not, because there weren't such things around at the time. These are just very broad wooden wheel tires with metal straps on them, and they didn't do so much damage to the road. But the other thing that new act, the Newquay to Aberaeron road, anticipated was the introduction of steam-powered vehicles. I'm certain that there were none ever used in Ceredigion, but they were around, and there was the possibility that it would become more popular, so it was built into the act. And you had to pay an enormous sum of 2 shillings and 6pence if you went through one of the gates with one of these. They frightened the horses, they were unreliable, and they never were very successful. Oops. And this map shows all the trust turnpike roads in the county. The orange ones were those established in 1770, the first ones, and most of these would have been just improving the existing roads. And then gradually they added more roads, improved roads. It built the new road from Aberaeron to Lampeter. They were going to build a new road from Llanrasted to Tregaron, but never did that. And that's the new road from Aberystwyth across towards Llangerig. Then we have the Rebecca Riots, and the charges that were placed on people using the roads at toll gates were one of the many reasons for the riots occurring. They really began when there was very bad weather and the crops were very poor, and so people were starving, and then they were then still expected to pay to go through the gates. And so a number of gates were smashed up by the rioters. There had been 22 gates in the county at the beginning of the riots. 9 out of 10 in the south of the county were attacked, and 5 were taken away. There was a lot of support for the rioters, in fact, because the Times reporter in South Wales understood the problems, and he reported back to the readers, and it was agreed that the rioters did have a case. So in the north of the county, there wasn't so much rioting, and only 4 of the 12 gates were attacked, and 2 were removed. One was referred to as a bar, and there's a place called Temple Bar halfway between Abereiron and Lampeter, and I do wonder whether that bar was a bar across the road, not a gate, for charging people to use that bit of road. But I can't be certain of that. And as a result of the riots, there was yet another act, and they put together all the 3 counties, Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire and Cardiganshire, under one act, got rid of a lot of the gates, and then later on, of course, the county council took over the roads. So I just want to finish by talking about a few of the other milestones around the county. They've got a little bit of a story to go with them. This one was built before the first Turnpike Act, and I'm quite sure it was erected on behalf of one of the big landowners in the area. This is on the road between Tregaron and Lampeter. And the sitemen who are named on this were surveyors, and it's 4 miles from Lampeter. 1768, 2 years before the first act. So this is a private road that was improved. And this is a milestone, but it's really just to commemorate the improvement of that road, so people would know who to thank, I suppose. This is another very early stone, and it's upside down because it's been built into a cottage, I think some distance from where it was meant to be, and it is inscribed Card, which I assume is Cardigan, 6 miles, to LANP, which is really odd. It's definitely a LAMP, which I assume is Lampeter, misspelt, 30 miles. And so that's what I think some of the original milestones might have looked like. All the milestones to the south of Abereiron look like this. They are square, flat-sided, and with a very slightly rounded top. They're very distinct, and they all have just one name on them. All the ones between Abereiron and Cardigan just have the distances to Cardigan. So you don't know how far you've got from Abereiron or how far you're going to have to travel to get to Abereiron with these. But in the north of the county, they all look like this. They're all hemispherical, semicircular round tops with very smooth surfaces. And we know that these were erected in 1896 by the county council, because there is an order in their minutes saying we want 44 of these, which is about right for the whole of the north of the county, at 25 shillings each, including engraving and delivery. So there is this very clear distinction in the milestones between the 2 halves of the counties. What happened to all the old milestones, and there must have been some, we do not know. Nobody's ever found any bits except that one I've just showed you of the milestone upside down. So they may have been smashed up or reused in walls, and one day somebody's going to find one. Oh, there is one, I'll show you in a moment. So they look like this. This is one at Llanrystyd. All those between Abereiron and Aberystwyth have the distance to Aberystwyth on them. And then this is north of Aberystwyth on the Machantlaeth Road, and it's got a cast iron plate on it. And I think that's an old stone. And I'd love to know what's underneath it. So if you ever see that stone without its plate on, you'll know that it's me that took the plate off, just to find out what's underneath. But on the road between Abereiron and Lampeter, there are a group of rather unusual stones, and this one in particular has a Welsh phrase on it, and Blwyddyn in the year 1859. I don't think that's when it was set up. Somebody painted that on then, or carved it in, but we don't know why. It doesn't make sense. But this is a North Ceredigion type of stone. And most of those stones actually don't have Aberystwyth on, they have Lampeter and Abereiron on them, like this one. So it's just got Abereiron 1, Lampeter 12, and the next one is Abereiron 2, Lampeter 11, and so on all the way along. And you can see there's a bit hacked away here, and most of them have that. And I think it was an Ordnance Survey datum level point like that, which is extremely like a nod covering the mystic mark, which is used by the Gorseth of Bards, but it isn't one of those. It's an Ordnance Survey level point they use to do surveying with. But they were hacked off because they were found to be inaccurate. And then in Aberystwyth, exactly a mile from the centre of Aberystwyth, there are 3 other stones with lots of place names on. And at the time these were set up, which I think is the 1890s or early 20th century even, you would never travel to these places by road. You would always go by train. So I think these are harking back to the old coaching days. They're just a memory of what those roads were used for, and somebody found the money, and I think the town council must have done it, but somebody found the money to erect these with all those wonderful place names on. And you can see those on the 3 main roads leading out of Aberystwyth. And on the main road between Llandyssil, where there was a train station at Llandyssil Road, and Newquay, where so many people went on holiday, there's a whole series of cast iron milestones or mile posts. And we know these were ordered in 1894 at 15 shillings and 9pence each, including fixing and painting. And they were used on the main road between those 2 places by the railway vehicles, which took people from the railway station in Llandyssil to their holiday destination at Newquay, and people could mark off the miles as they got closer to Newquay, or mark them off as they were leaving their holiday destination. So most of those survive, but of course they're quite fragile, and a knock with a vehicle would smash them. And then finally we have this lovely stone, which may be one of the earliest in the county, and it's on the road that I showed a photograph of earlier on between the A44 and Devil's Bridge. It's actually on that back road to Devil's Bridge, and beautifully inscribed, still painted, still there, but it's the only one of its type, and I think that might be the only one still up from the earliest stones that were erected around the county. So I'm going to stop there, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have.